How's it going everyone? I hope you're all doing good. Welcome to this study session in which I'm going to be drawing the skull. If you are not familiar with these videos, study sessions are a way for me to document my own learning process and pass on what I learn. So here I'm going to start by looking at the proportions of the skull, drawing some front, side and 3/4 views, and then I'll take a look at its overall anatomy, look at the bones which make up the skull and what I should know to be able to draw it from imagination on any angle. So on screen right now I am drawing out what looks like a grid, and these units of the grid help me divide up the skull into equal sections. On a typical front view, the skull is 3 units tall and 2 units wide. And this proportional system that I'm using here is by Loomis. Many of you will know if you've watched some of the previous videos that I used his method for drawing the figure as a whole, and he also has some good methods when it comes to drawing the human head. And I'm sure we'll take a look at all of that more in depth in future videos. However, this system that he has for drawing heads involves these same dividing lines, which are good to know in order to make sure the proportions are correct. As always, there are alternative proportional systems for the skull, but after doing my research, I settled on Loomis. I do think that his work is the most accessible for people who are new to drawing, and I'm all for making things simple. So remember, as a general rule, the skull can be divided into 3 equal units, and so now that I have these lines drawn out, I can use them to help me draw the features of the skull. Again, I'm just going to produce some simple orthographic views here at the start, and I'll start by drawing this front view. I'm also going to keep an image of the skull in the top corner of the screen so that you can see the various features that I'm drawing here. So to begin, I find the halfway point of that middle unit and divide it in half. Now on the skull, you'll see what looks almost like an upside down love heart that has been stretched out a little bit, and this is the nasal aperture. And if you haven't guessed already, it's where the nose goes, and you can see how it's positioned at the bottom half of that middle unit. Above this there is the nasal bone, which is a rather small bone in comparison to the rest, and again you'll be able to see the form and shape of these features more clearly when I start to draw skulls on various angles, but in terms of this front view you can see that it's 1/4 of this middle unit. Now the section above that is the space between the eye sockets, and this section might be more important than you think. Let me show you this for a moment. This is a drawing from Hampton's book, Figure Drawing, Design and Invention, and he refers to this small section as the keystone, describing how it's an important point to reinforce your perspective, because here this section of the skull is rather flat in comparison to the sockets which push inwards and the nasal bone which pushes outwards. This information will come more into play as I start to draw the skulls on many angles in perspective though, so we'll get to that. I just wanted to show you this. So back to this front view, here I'm going to draw in the eye sockets now, and these are going to be positioned slightly below that top line, and they're also going to be slightly below that bottom line. I've seen people draw the skull and have them perfectly positioned in that top half, but then I find that the top of the skull appears too short, and in most cases you have to add some height to the top. So rather than doing that, I placed these eye sockets slightly lower down, and I'm not just doing this because I want to do it. I'm actually referring to this anatomy book by Stonehouse. In fact, the skull that I'm drawing here is like a hybrid between Loomis and Stonehouse. I even went ahead and drew my 3 equal units over a diagram of the skull in this book, and it worked well, so this was the front view that I was drawing. So now I'm going to draw the top of the skull, starting by drawing a curved line up and around the eye sockets into what is called the frontal bone, because, well, it's at the front. This bone forms the rounded shape of the skull on this front view, and it fits nicely within the top section here. Going back down to the middle sections at the bottom half towards the sides, I draw the shape of what's called the zygomatic bones, and these are a real standout feature of the skull. You'll get a better idea of how these appear soon, but you can even see from this front view how these stick out slightly and curve around. Also, notice how these fit within this bottom half of the middle unit. From each of these I curve some lines down into that bottom section, and this central part of the skull is called the maxilla, but we will look at that more closely soon. So I have drawn most of the skull now, and this bottom half is going to be where the mandible will be. The mandible is the name of the jawbone, and it's one solid bone that acts like a hinge. That's why I'm able to open and close my mouth and talk right now. Anyways, this bottom section can be divided in half, and that's the point between the top and bottom teeth. So with that in mind, I start to draw this out. And again, at this stage, I'm always referring to the diagram in the book. I draw out the teeth for the skull, and then I start to draw out the mandible. The shape of this is pretty distinct, and you can see from this front view how it angles down towards the front. There's a slightly large space at the bottom for the chin. In fact, this part sticks out a little and is referred to as the mental protuberance. I'm hoping that I pronounce these names correctly. Another important feature to point out is that on this front view, you can see that separating space at either side of the mandible, and that's because the mandible is like a separate bone which sits below the rest of the skull. Again, that hinge analogy will make more sense when you take a look at the skull on a side view. Speaking of which, I'm almost done with this front view now, but before we move on, I just want to show you one last thing. Here I take a compass and position it in the centre of the top 2 units. Now because the skull is also 2 equal units wide, I essentially have a square, which means I am able to draw a perfect circle here. This circle, which can be a ball in perspective, can also be useful to know. I also draw another smaller circle below, and this one is for the lower half of the skull and fits nicely within the shape of the skull. So that's a front view of the skull, and I've explained a fair bit there, but now let's continue and draw the skull on a side view. So here I'm going to do the exact same as I did when I had drawn the front view. I create a grid that's 3 units high and 2 units wide. However, seeing as this is for a skull on a side view, we need to make it more than 2 units wide. To do this, I add around a third of a unit on each side. So overall, this side view will be 3 units high and 2 2/3 units wide. I'll go ahead and draw in that circle for the top section of the skull. Now on a side view, it's important to know that the shape of the skull isn't a perfect circle. Instead, it's more like a circle which has been squashed down a little, like the shape that I'm drawing here. So now I'm going to start drawing in some of the features, and seeing as we have our front view already, that helps because I can use that as a reference and see where to position these features. On a side view, the nasal aperture curves inwards and then out again at the bottom where it meets the maxilla bone. Here I add a nice curved line down to where the bottom of the mandible is, and eventually when I start to draw more skulls from imagination, you'll often see me use just one curved line like this rather than drawing in all of the teeth. The eye socket is again positioned below the top line and also below the bottom line and curves inwards like so. And then here on this side view, it'll give you a better idea of this zygomatic bone. A section of this bone spans all the way around into the side of the skull. It meets what is called the temporal bone. Along with this, I draw in the mandible, another bone that you can understand more by observing the skull on a side view. Notice the U-like shape at the top as it sits under the zygomatic bone, and how it curves down to the front of the skull. So all of these features are drawn out now, and I can develop the overall shape of the skull, and as I do this, I'm not really working outside of that squashed circle shape that I had started with the exception being at the bottom of the skull here, you'll find that the circle seems to level out. There's also a bone called the mastoid which sticks out. So here is a side view of the skull. I'll finish this one off by drawing the separating lines of each bones, and soon I'm going to colour code all of this so that you can see which bones are where. Anyways, we have a front and a side view now, so on this next page let's draw a 3/4 view. To draw this 3/4 view, I start with a line which is divided into 3 sections again, but rather than creating a grid for this one, I'm going to start with the circle, or the ball as I like to refer to it, Now at the front here, I'm going to lightly draft out an oblong shape. And this is something that I saw in Stonehouse's anatomy book. He draws the skull on many angles, starting with these two simple shapes. But what's more important here as I start to draw out this skull is the three sections that I use to help position the features of the skull. Now on this 3/4 view, the eye socket which is away from me will be placed behind the nasal bone which sticks out. Also notice how these eye sockets curve inwards. The halfway line I know will be where the top of the nasal aperture is, and from that point, using these lines along with the front and side view as reference, I can draw this out. At this stage I am of course studying from reference. I actually found a useful 3D model online which I'll link in the description. I found it very helpful to be able to rotate a model of a skull around in a 3D space and see how it appears. This model of the skull also included a grid which was the same as what I was working with here, and so that's really good because I know that I can study from the model, knowing that it is following the same method when it comes to the proportions, a method again that I believe came from Andrew Loomis. Also, I saw that Proco, a channel that I think I referred to in the last video as well, he sells these small physical models of the skull and he based those on this same proportional system. And I really want to get one of those. Anyways, here I have almost finished this 3/4 view, and again, the main reason I'm creating these typical views is so that I can study the proportions as well as get an idea of where each of these bones will go. Now that I have these views drawn out, I'm going to take some coloured pencils, and I know what you're thinking, Dan actually owns some coloured pencils. Well, I'm going to use these to colour code the various bones which make up the skull, and I'll create a key with the name of each bone. So first up, in orange, we have what is called the frontal bone. I'll put some images up of each of these bones isolated from the rest of the skull. This frontal bone is rather large and hence the name, it's at the front of the skull. In green will be the sphenoid bone, and this one is also large in size but is located centrally within the cranium, so you only see it on the outside in some areas, as you can see here. In purple there is the maxilla. This has a cool name and it's also pretty cool in shape. It sits at the front and it can also be considered the upper jawbone. Next, up in yellow, the zygomatic bones at either side of the skull. These provide the skeletal framework for the cheeks and they also contribute to the section of bone which forms the eye sockets. In blue, there is the temporal bones. Again, there's one of these at either side, and these are a pair of large bones that have a feature which meets the zygomatic bones. Next, let's use pink to indicate the parietal bone, a large bone at the top of the cranium. In brown, and I almost forgot about this one, is the small nasal bone. This contributes to the formation of the bridge of the nose. In red will be the mandible, and this is a large single U-shaped bone for the lower jaw. And finally, in grey, we have the occipital bone, and this is the bone at the back of the skull. So these are all of the names of each of these bones which make up the skulls. It's not too essential to remember the names, but I think it's good to know. I'm making a colour key now so that I keep note of these names. And yeah, I think this has been very beneficial, but I'm not done yet because what I want to do now is I'm going to make some additional notes and draw out some small diagrams which will help me understand the form and features of the skull. Again, this sketchbook that I have here is something that I'm using as a means of storing information that I can later look back on as reference. I do intend on creating another video drawing skulls on various angles from my imagination, but before I can do that, I need to familiarise myself with them so that I know what I'm drawing. That's what I've started to realise as well. The more you know about something, the better you can draw it. It's like having a library of information in your head that you can lean on when you are tasked with drawing from your imagination, and there's actually a term for it. It's referred to as your visual library. So doing things like this helps me improve that. This of course is in a time lapse here, but you can see these diagrams and notes that I'm making. Also, remember that all of my study pages are posted onto Patreon, so if you want to have these yourself, then be sure to check that out. There's a link in the description. Anyways, here I'm just creating some simple diagrams to illustrate some of the important rules to remember when drawing the skull. In the top corner there, you can see the simplified head shape, and below I've shown that the eyes sit slightly below that centre line. All of this information will be put to use when I draw the skull on more angles. As I draw these out, I still refer to the 3D model of the skull that I have on screen, and I rotate it around to draw various features like this zygomatic bone. You can see how between that and the temporal bone there is an arch, and how the skull on a side view is more of an oval shape and wider in size. I continue to make some notes around the 3/4 view here, and below next to this colour key I'm going to have a go at drawing the skull on some more angles, and as I said, this is something I will be doing a lot more in the next video I think, but here you can see how I start with the ball and then I draw these lines for the 3 units. I then add an oval shape to block out the skull as well as establish the angle of the skull. Now I'll use my lines here to help me draw this, and I do want to point out that I am still continuing to study from reference here. I don't want you to think that I'm drawing from my imagination just yet. It's always best to start by studying from reference anyways. Here again, I'll draw this on an opposite angle so you can see the back of the skull. To finally fill this remaining space on the page, I'll draw out some more skulls next to their simplified versions. I'm going to draw these ones as if I'm looking at them from above and below. So I think that's it for this page. I have gone through a lot in this video. I really wasn't expecting it to be this long, but I hope that you found this one informative, and if you want to see more then be sure to give the video a like. I will be posting these final pages to Patreon, so consider checking those out there, and with all that being said, thanks for watching this study session. I'll see you in the next one. If you enjoyed the content I create, then do consider becoming a patron on Patreon. You will gain access to exclusive tutorials, study documents, process papers, real-time drawing footage and more. Plus you will also be supporting me in a more personal way. Other than that, thank you for watching this video and I'll see you soon.